Pastor Lon Harden, our Chair of Planning and Zoning. Pastor Harden.
Good evening, everyone. Today is August the 12th?
13th.
13th, man. August the 13th, 2026 p.m. This meeting is set aside for the Planning and Zoning Committee workshop. At this time, we call this meeting to order, and we first ask that all Planning and Zoning members that are here on the call, please state your name for the record. I am Lon Harden, Chairman, Planning and Zoning.
I'm Mike Gerwig, Planning and Zoning.
Hi, Dana Lee, Planning and Zoning.
Pamela Mindell, Planning and Zoning.
Okay, do we have Ms. Diane Hicklin on? I know she just attempt to call me, so she'll probably be joining very shortly. Okay. So we'll be turning this workshop off to be leading by Mr. Ben Perkins, our city attorney, to guide us through our ordinances that we have before us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everybody for being here. I'm sorry I haven't met you in person, but due to the virus, that's probably understandable by you guys. What I understand my role here today is to provide you with an overview of the three ordinances that you'll be considering, those being the zoning ordinance, subdivision regulations, and the building regulations. And so I'll start by going over the zoning ordinance, proposed amended and restated zoning ordinance. And I'm just going to give you a high-level overview. And I'd ask that you let me know if you have any questions along the way. In other words, please stop me with any questions. I do think that after I'm done, that there's going to be time for public comments. So my suggestion, if Mr. Harden agrees, would be that questions asked of me during this phase should be from members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Is that okay with you, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So first on the I thought it would be best if I first discuss with you the proposed amended and restated zoning ordinance. And so, the first most obvious question would be why are we doing this? And the reason is that the ordinance needed to be updated. When we first looked at it, we noticed that it had clearly been borrowed. I think somebody may need to place their phone on mute.
It's via Ring Central now. Do you want the dollar number? You want me to send you the information?
So the ordinance clearly had been borrowed in part from Effingham County, and in fact it had some language referring to Effingham County when it should have been referring to our city, just as an example. And there were other issues like that we felt needed updating. And so as far as major changes that you will see, one change is that it is proposed that there be a new zoning district, that being the mixed use district. There's also a significant change, which is the addition of a sign ordinance. And the reason for that is that as far as we know, we haven't found an existing Guyton sign ordinance. And so we thought that would be important to add. There's also some other more minor changes that you may notice as we go through, especially those of you who have served on the commission for a while. So I believe some of you are new to zoning. Is that correct? Some of you have not been on the planning commission until this year. Is that right?
Correct. We have a couple of people, Ms. Dana Lee and Ms. Tamla Midell.
Okay. Well, I thought I would go ahead and provide a brief overview of zoning, and I think the easiest way to do so is to talk about zoning districts. And so we have a number of zoning districts in the city already. As I said, the only thing that is proposed to be added here is the addition of a mixed-use district. But let's talk about the R1 district just as an example. The R1 district has uses that are permitted, and that means a use that is permitted as a matter of right. If your property is in the R1 single-family zoning district, then that means you, as a matter of right, can construct a single-family residence on it. You, as a matter of right, could construct a park or a playground on it, etc. And then there are also special permitted uses is the language in here. I've noticed in some past zoning minutes, they referred to them as specially permitted uses or special use permits. It's the same concept. It means you're not allowed as a matter of right to have that use on the property, but you can apply for the opportunity to use your property in that way. For example, you're not permitted as a matter of right to have a public school or a private school on a property that's zoned R1, but if you get council approval, you could do that. Similarly, there are other similar things such as poultry, for example. That would be something that you would be not allowed to have on your property, but you could you could apply for the right to do that. One of the members of this commission asked a question specifically about having chickens or ducks or something like that on their property. If we approve this amended and restated ordinance, does that mean I'm prohibited from having chickens on my property, even though I've had chickens on my property for the past 15 years or something like that? And the answer to that question is no. This ordinance has a grandfathering section in it, and you'll see that on pages 39 to 40. It's on section 709, and that section of the ordinance explicitly addresses the fact that if there is what's called a non-conforming use that was in existence before this ordinance is adopted, then that use is allowed to continue, except unless there is a change to that non-conforming use, meaning you go from farming, from having chickens to having hogs. Well, that's a change in the use. That's not allowed. You'd have to get a special permit to do that. And there's other examples as well. For example, if you stop having chickens on your property for longer than 1 year, then you would have to go to council to apply for a special permit to do that. And I'm sorry, I keep saying going to council. You would actually, for a special use permit, you would first go to this commission for that right. So that's a basic overview of how the process works. You got your permitted uses, you've got your specially permitted uses. And that's the case for, I believe, every single one of these of your zoning districts have permitted and special uses in them. I wanted to briefly call your attention now to the mixed use district that's proposed, and you'll find that on page 24 of this ordinance. And the mixed use district, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but the concept is a mixture of residential and commercial uses. You see that a great deal everywhere. You see it a lot in Savannah, for example, on Broughton Street. You'll see downstairs commercial, upstairs residential. And so, and I believe you already have probably some of those in Guyton, but this would allow for that to occur specifically. And in my view, it's a great district to have. No property is currently zoned mixed use, as far as I recall, but you have the opportunity to do that. And I would expect, as Guyton is experiencing growth, I would expect that you will see applications to rezone properties to a mixed use district in the future. So I do think it's a good idea to have this on the books. It just gives you another option to accommodate growth. On page 47 of the ordinance, we have a proposed sign regulations. And these sign regulations are fairly easy to understand, I would think. And they basically go through the process for being authorized to have signs, the number of signs, things like that. And by the way, signage means everything from a for sale sign all the way to a billboard. I mean, so this is a all-encompassing sign ordinance in here, and it I think it's pretty thorough. But again, this is the time. This is one of the opportunities to talk about it suggest changes or something like that. But I don't think you'll find them to be very onerous. They're pretty straightforward, and in fact, they are consistent with the sign ordinances of other cities in Effingham County. Now I wanted to turn to the roles of the Planning and Zoning Commission, which many of you are familiar with, but some are not. This Planning and Zoning Commission has a good bit of power, and that's different than some other planning and zoning commissions. There's a lot of planning and zoning commissions in Effingham County and elsewhere that really play more of an advisory role, and that's still a really important role. It's that first stop in a lot of processes related to land use. But with this commission currently has and is proposed to continue to have a good bit of power. And so let me talk to you about that. As I mentioned earlier, one of the roles that this commission has is to hold hearings on applications for special permits, meaning that special permitted uses I was talking about earlier. And you'll see that on page 59, that's section 1005. And your role is to hold hearings on such an application and also to vote on that. And your decision is final unless the applicant appeals. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the amount of power you have is the buck stops with you unless there's an appeal from your decision. Also, it's important for you to know, and I can tell from the minutes in the past that you guys are well aware of this, those of you who've already served, is you're governed by standards when you're considering an application for a special use permit. And those are on page 60 and 61. And so those are things like the size of the use compared to the surrounding uses, the intensity of the use, including the impact on surrounding uses. Just using the hog farm as an example, if it's a small lot and there are neighbors nearby, you're likely going to have concerns if somebody comes to you and says, I'd like a special use to have 15 hogs on my half-acre lot. And so all those standards are there, and those are really useful to you because they will guide you in the process of deciding how to vote on an application for standard use permits. And again, it's really important that you do consider those standards when you are voting on an application for such a permit. You also have, all right, so now moving on to variances. This commission hears applications for variances on a fairly regular basis from what I can tell from the prior minutes. And so again, you're familiar with this, and it's really, I think, this language I think is almost identical to, it is almost identical to the language you had before. So you have that authority again to hold hearings on variances and then to grant variances from the zoning ordinance. Variances are frequently sought, as you probably know, but it's actually a hard standard to meet because the property owner has to show hardship due to the lot. And so, and it has to be, can't be the fault of the reason for the hardship can't be something that the property owner did or his or her predecessor did. So, and so there's also criteria and standards for you to follow when considering an application. And I think it's important for you to remember that those criteria state that the variance can be granted only if all of those circumstances that are listed on page 62 are met. And all is a big word. It means literally every single one of those standards are met. And so sometimes after reading standards like these, which are common standards, I will hear either a council member or a commission member or a property owner say, how in the world could I ever meet all of those standards? Well, it's possible. I was looking at minutes from a meeting, it was in the past year that you held, and the property owner met it. And so it is possible, but it is difficult, and it's intentionally difficult because the idea is that you draft your ordinance now, the city drafts its ordinance now to meet the needs of the city, and therefore variances should not be a common thing. So But there are times when they can be granted. I was trying to think of a good example. I think setbacks are a good example of a variance that, application that oftentimes can be appropriate to be granted. A person could have a corner lot with an irregular shape or something like that, and because their neighbor is right next door, it just may be really difficult for them to satisfy the setback requirements, meaning the distance from the structure to the property line. It may be really difficult for that property owner to meet it due to that shape of the lot and things like that. But in your discretion, after reviewing those standards, you may think, you know what, we'll give them some relaxation of those setback lines because they meet these standards, and really they wouldn't be able to build anything other than a pillbox on this property if we didn't. So that's kind of my brief overview of variances. But like I say, they're not to be granted as a matter of right. The applicant has to meet those standards. And again, this shows the power that's vested in this commission, because unless there's an appeal to the city council from your decision on the variance application is final. On page 63, section 1007, the Planning Commission has the right to provide interpretations of the official zoning map. I think those are pretty uncommon, but it is possible that you would have a party come to you and seek an interpretation of the zoning map. And in particular, if this ordinance is adopted, you may actually have that arise, and I think that'll be pretty short-lived. But you could have a property owner who feels that their property has been rezoned or something like that by virtue of this map, and they come to you and say, can you help us, give us guidance on this? We thought we were AR1, now we're R1, what's the deal? Something like that, and then so you can walk them through the process. Mr. Mayor, am I right? Y'all did have an AR1 zoning, or there was property zoned AR1 previously?
There was property zoned AR1 by our old code. All property that is zoned into the city or annexed into the city is supposed to be immediately zoned R1. It just wasn't done on the map.
Right. So, I think you'll be able to handle it pretty easily, which is, property is annexed or something like that. If it was annexed as AR1 from Effingham County, then we don't have AR1 on the books. And so it has to come in as R1, and the annexation statute makes it very clear that you bring it in as close as you can to what it had. But if you don't have it, then you got to get it as close as you can. But you may have questions like that come to you. I'm expecting a lot of these questions to be more informal than that. But I do expect some questions to arise because of the fact that what's proposed to be done is a nice new updated zoning map is proposed to be adopted. So I would expect that you will hear some questions in that regard, and that may be the mechanism by which you hear those questions is through your role as providing interpretations of the zoning map. You also, on page 64, will see that you will receive appeals from decisions of city staff that enforce the zoning ordinance, and that can come to you in a myriad number of contexts. But essentially, if the planning director, if we have a planning director, or the city manager, whoever, makes a decision on a zoning related matter, the applicant that otherwise wouldn't necessarily come to you, that applicant can appeal the decision that's made to you, and then you'll render a decision on that matter. You also have the authority to recommend amendments to the zoning ordinance or the map. And of course, that's one of the reasons that we're here before you today, is because a proposed amended and restated zoning ordinance is being considered. And so, that's the reason we're here before you today, is because that is one of the roles that you play, in addition to holding hearings and things like that on proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance, is to actually issue recommendations. Obviously, as we're here today, we're looking for recommendations, changes, suggestions, anything like that that you may have, problems, typos, anything like that. But that is a big role that you have. And, it comes up a lot of times in a reactive sense, which isn't a bad thing, by the way, in city government. City government a lot of times has to operate in a reactive way, but you may have an applicant or something like that come before you and, basically say to you, well, how can I do this? It's impossible. This ordinance has me handcuffed or something like that. Now, that may trigger you, commission, on your own rather than that applicant even to say, you know what, we need to adopt a resolution asking that the city consider amending this section because it's flawed in some way. And that's section 1201 where the language for that is done. But as far as the formality of how you would do that, you would want to do it by resolution. That's what your ordinance says. Resolutions can be oral or written. If your situation is as simple as you just want the city to take a look at it or something like that, I would just recommend, I'd make a motion to make an oral resolution to request that the city take a closer look at section so-and-so of the ordinance. And then as soon as that's done, staff will have that resolution transmitted to city council for consideration of that request. You could also, of course, make a resolution, to do something really specific where you actually have the language already in hand, pass it up to the city council that way. That's another way to do the same thing. You also, on page 65, have the role of reviewing and making decisions, making recommendations about proposed zoning amendments and rezonings, and I think we're all familiar with that. Note this, so if an applicant comes to this, makes an application to rezone his or her property, the way that this ordinance is written is that the commission shall submit its report within 30 days after receiving that amendment for a rezoning application. Otherwise, the amendment's deemed to be approved by this commission. That deadline, you may not like that, and that's something we can talk about. But I do think this is a change. Okay, this is something I recommended. And the reason that I think a deadline of some sort or another is important is because otherwise the Planning and Zoning Commission could hold up something forever, because the ordinance as it's written is saying that proposed rezoning applications have to come through the Planning and Zoning Commission. So, in theory, everybody on the commission could just not like that application and could just sit on it. And at least theoretically, then city council wouldn't be able to take the issue up. And that's not good. It may sound good to you at first blush, well, yeah, I'd love to hold something up, but ultimately would expose the city to liability concerns from a due process standpoint if you just held something up forever. So that's the mechanism. But like I say, it says 30 days. If you think 30 days is too short of a time, I don't know how hard that is for you guys to meet. But if you're not able to schedule something within 30 days of notice that you need to schedule something, then you may want to suggest that that date be expanded to 45 days or something like that.
Ben, can you confirm, is it 30 days from the petition that's filed at City Hall, or when does the 30-day window start?
The way it's written is it says that the commission will submit its report within 30 days after receiving an amendment proposal from city council for review. And do you remember, Bobo, how it's written? Okay, I'm pretty sure that means 30 days from the receipt of the application. I'd have to make it positive, but I think it is, that's the way I read that to say is basically receipt of the application by the city itself.
And that would be for any action, whether it's zoning or variances or appeals, or is that all encompassing, or?
The way this is written is it's related to just amendment to the zoning ordinance.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so finally, I think just something I forgot to mention earlier, but it relates to rezoning again, is the fact that you can rezone property with conditions. And so, or you could approve an application to rezone property with conditions. So let's say Ben Perkins' property is zoned R1, and it's a big wide lot, and then the property to the right and the left are zoned R1 as well, and Perkins comes to you with an application to rezone his property to commercial. Well, the neighbors don't really care, but they're worried about having to see whatever I'm doing on my commercial property. And even, in fact, let's say Perkins even says, fine, tell me what to do and I'll do it. But you could then say, okay, we'll agree to rezone to C commercial, but you've got to have a big buffer on your property. You've got to have, vegetative buffer. You've got to have something else here. You could actually say one of the conditions is, well, you can do commercial, but you can't have some of the permitted uses in a commercial district. So you always have that right to do a conditional rezoning, and it's an important tool sometimes. It's really an important tool sometimes when everybody comes to you, all the surrounding property owners are all in agreement. We're willing to do this, but we want landowner to, jump through a certain hoop, and landowner says, okay. Well, in that instance, it's a great way to do it. Then you recommend approval with conditions. On the other hand, I will tell you that conditions are an administrative headache.
Yeah.
So because people forget, and so a lot of times the zoning maps don't. The zoning map just says it's zone commercial, and so it's harder to track those conditions, but nonetheless, they're a useful tool, and I think every city in America eventually has adopted a rezoning or approved a rezoning with conditions, and so you have that power as well to make those recommendations on a rezoning application. This ordinance contains procedures for calling public hearings, and there are some changes to those procedures. And so I just wanted to call that to your attention. The most important thing about the procedures for conducting public hearings for you to know is that it's required by the zoning procedures law, by the state law. We have to have these. And of those that are most important is actually the time limits. You have to provide the people in favor of the application and the opponents to speak no less than 10 minutes per side. And that's imperative. That's required by state law to give them the opportunity to speak 10 minutes per side. Now, where this gets confusing is that that doesn't mean necessarily that does not necessarily mean 10 minutes per speaker. But if the applicant herself comes to you for rezoning, and he or she wants to speak for the full 10 minutes, you need to let them do that. And then on the opponents, you similarly need to be making sure that the opponents have at least 10 minutes of time in which to speak. But after that, you don't need to. You're not required to hear overly redundant comments. So after that first 10-minute mark is hit, and then let's say you got a line out the door of people that want to speak in opposition. It's common for the chairman, to remind people, hey, look, if you're here to say the same thing over and over, we would rather expedite the process and move forward. Please, try and keep your comments as concise as you can and things like that. So you're in control. It's not unlimited. It's not saying 10 minutes per speaker, but the requirement that you allow a cumulative 10 minutes per side really is important.
Okay, Mr. Perkins.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask you a question on that. That's the perfect example that you just gave. There's a long line about opposition, and you couldn't give 50 people a time frame. Would it be good to say, okay, ma'am, sir, are you for or against this zoning requirement, and just limit it to that? They'll say for, against, and pretty much take a consensus in that particular way to kind of streamline and reduce a lot of time and talk, especially when there's a 10-minute limit. And of course, for that amount of people, it would definitely exceed that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And absolutely, that's appropriate. And so, when I say 10-minute, I mean, y'all can let it go on as long as you want. If you want to let everybody speak for hours, and sometimes it's a good idea to do that, just let everybody vent. But yes, after some point, you're going to hear the same thing from every speaker. And it's almost amazing how group speak happens. It's like, I think a lot of times they come in with something else to say, where they heard the first 5 speakers say it, and that's all they want to talk about is, traffic. And yes, it's absolutely appropriate to say, are you for, are you opposed? And, even a show of hands at some point. Is everybody here opposed because of traffic? And, I mean, you know, eventually you just can't hear it. It gets over the top. So yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Also, you'll find that this ordinance contains standards or criteria to govern your decisions on applications to rezone property. That's on page 69. I think these were already in there, mostly. Yeah. Right. So these were already in there. I bring it up to you just to tell you that it's important that you consider those criteria when you're voting on a rezoning amendment. Obviously, this is not a, you know, the applicant doesn't have to meet every single one of these criteria, but those criteria are really important for you to consider when you're deciding what action to take on an application for rezoning. In addition, this is more of a staff thing, but these criteria and the procedures for conducting the hearing should be made available to the public. You know, so if you ever hear a member of the public say, "I don't even know what you're considering when you're voting on this application," that's a trigger to you to say, "These are the criteria that we consider when we're, you know, voting on your rezoning application," because they do need to be made available to the public. And sometimes it makes the applicant do a better job, you know, which is good for all of us. You know, I don't care if it's the most obnoxious use in the world. At least if they realize these are criteria you're considering, that at least they can, you know, address some of those criteria. And it's also good for the people who speak opposed to rezoning applications, because I find that sometimes opponents are of the not in my backyard ilk, which is, I don't like it because it's near me, as opposed to I don't like it because of traffic. And so, you know, again, having these criteria available to them enables them to potentially articulate a reason that you could hang your hat on, because you can't hang your hat on, I don't like it. You know, you need to actually be able to, you know, you need a better reason than that, such as traffic density. It's not a logical extension, etc. And you know, and for example, a great reason to deny rezoning is because of that example I gave you. Perkins is surrounded on both sides by residential properties, and Perkins comes to you asking that you rezone it to commercial. That is not a logical extension. It's inconsistent with surrounding uses. You know, that's a great basis for you to deny. And of course, similarly, if Perkins is surrounded by commercial and he's residential and he comes to you to seek to rezone to commercial, chances are you're going to find that those criteria are met. It's going to be hard to justify denying that application. I'm not saying never, but I handle a lot of zoning litigation, and that's the one that always scares me. When the city gets sued and I see that they denied a rezoning for an applicant who was surrounded by properties zoned the manner in which he or she wants to be zoned. If the city denies that application, I'm automatically nervous that I'm not going to win. So that's all I've got on the zoning ordinance. I'll turn to the other ordinances. Does anybody have anybody on the commission have any questions about or the city council have any questions about the zoning ordinance?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm a little confused with what you just said with the mixed use, and then you said that the confusion of residential, commercial next to each other. So how does that interplay? I don't understand that.
That's a great question. Okay, so in the mixed use district, there is going to be a mix, but on the other hand, in a R1 district, there's not going to be a mix. That's going to be the single family residential district. Now, eventually, there is going to be a commercial district next door to a residential district, right? I mean, an R1 right. district. So in those scenarios, I can't remember all your districts, but let's assume everything from the traffic circle to City Hall is commercial, and then everything past that is residential, R1. If that was true, and the property owner next to City Hall on the main road said, came to the city and sought to be rezoned to commercial, that property owner has a decent argument that they should be rezoned. On the other hand, there's a good argument against it because the property next to him, the property north of him, is also R1. So does that help you understand what I'm getting at? There's a difference. I mean, the mixed use is a district in which mixed uses are allowed. Otherwise, R1 is a district in which, you know, commercial uses are not allowed.
So there's a definition between mixed use. In other words, it has to be like a commercial building and then a residential above it to qualify only?
Right. So let's take another look. So that's on page 24. The uses permitted in the mixed-use residential commercial district include single-family dwellings, including a single-family dwelling with a first floor of retail or service above it. So a property owner could have a single-family dwelling in the mixed-use district, just a house. They could have that if they wanted to. But they also would have, if they're in the mixed-use district, that same property owner would have the right to install a purely commercial or purely retail facility in that property, or if it's a two-story house, they could go to commercial on the ground floor and residential upstairs. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm understanding, but it just seems like, wow, that's cutting hairs really close. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem
Well,
like
it can be.
Go ahead.
It can be, except I'm sorry to use Savannah as an example, but it's just kind of low-hanging fruit because Savannah's a kind of one of the lodestar mixed-use cities in the nation. But you know, if you think about Savannah's Broaden Street as an example, there's nothing cutting that one close. It's all mixed use, right?
Right.
And so in this instance here, I think what's envisioned is this provides an opportunity to create a mixed-use district. I'm not sure where that would go, but it provides that opportunity to create one where you would have that kind of work-play mix. Am I right about that, Mr. Mayor? There's no property zone MU right now, right? That'd be impossible, I assume.
There's actually two properties that in my proposed zoning map that already have a downstairs commercial with an upstairs residential. Those, and we also, and it's been many years ago, I couldn't begin to tell you when, we had something come before the city where they were interested in building a few buildings that were downstairs commercial, upstairs residential, very similar to Savannah's build. And we just kind of had to look at them, smile and say, we don't have anything like that. So we're just trying to prepare for the future and growth and encourage potential projects like this.
And to help you visualize it, I would say this: a mixed-use district is, you know, it's not appropriate for everywhere. I mean, that mixed-use districts are typically on your main arteries, you know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So it can't be like in a neighborhood. It has to be like in a main artery or close to a shopping area, or.
That's definitely the way it's envisioned. I mean, I can't tell you it's impossible, but I mean, you know, in this city with this city government and this planning commission, I would say that's just about impossible because I don't think anybody would ever vote to do that. So yes, it's really envisioned for your main arteries.
Gotcha. I understand it. Got it.
All right. Anything else about the zoning ordinance? The rest of the discussion is a lot shorter.
I do have another question. It goes further on with the other ordinances. With the building codes and the Clean Water Act, as you might have saw in the email, also the 100-year flood plan, how couldn't we have them as references to make a better determination? Or because, I mean, if we just go by the guidelines, yet we don't know these other things, we're kind of like only 1/3 of what we should be knowing, in my opinion.
Right. Well, a couple of points there, and I'll get into those ordinances and we'll talk about it in a little more detail, but it's going to be very uncommon for you to be having to deal with any of those kind of issues. A lot of those issues are generally handled on the staff level.
Okay.
And so generally what you'll see in those contexts, I don't think I saw, actually I looked, I don't remember seeing any of those kind of appeals make it to the Planning Commission for the past year or so, but in the event that happens, you're gonna have staff level assistance. You know, you'll have your building official, your building inspector, you know, that person will have outlined in detail why he rejected the application for a certificate of occupancy or whatever it is, or the, you know, the permit or whatever it is.
Okay. That
Yeah,
was something that was really weighing on me. Like, how do we make a determination with just 1/3 of the information?
Right. No, yes, no. Luckily for you, you do not have to memorize or really. I would not even expect you to run into the need to be particularly familiar with the model building code, for example. That's what your building inspector uses.
Okay.
But typically, it's such a check the box kind of a scenario with building inspectors that you don't normally see it actually rise up, because the building inspector is going to say you didn't pour your foundation right, re-pour it. And that's usually a pretty black and white matter.
Okay.
Anybody else got any questions about the zoning ordinance?
Yes, I have one about the 30-day.
Okay.
This is Tamla. To be submitted, are we putting ourselves in a box by saying, okay, we're going to have this done in 30 days? Because like right now we're going through the pandemic, and certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. But if you stipulate to say it's 30 days, can that be put to 60 days, or can it be amended?
Yeah, that's a great point. So under the emergency laws that we're dealing with under the pandemic, certainly deadlines can be extended. So I think that would solve that concern, but you would still need city council. You'd still need city council to take some action to extend those deadlines. But that's a great point, and maybe a reason for us to think about extending that to 60 days or something like that. Because if we change it to 60 days, that gives more time for city council to say, you're right, hold on.
Right.
We need to extend this a little bit out for you, or adopt an ordinance that says, due to the emergency, the deadlines in the zoning ordinance are extended by 30 days or something like that.
But Ben, to verify, is the 30 days for all action, or is it just for amendments, proposals for the ordinance itself?
Just for amendments.
So the amendments generally would be submitted by the P&Z board, or how?
Really, we're talking about rezoning applications is really the main one I'm talking about.
Okay, so when you say amendments, are you talking about amendments to zoning?
I'm sorry. I'm just explain where I'm coming from. If you rezone your property, you're technically amending the zoning ordinance, because you've changed your zoning. And I'm sorry, I keep saying that, but
well, you said it, and I thought, I'm not sure I understand. Okay, so I agree with Tamla. 30 days might handcuff the board, because we've had issues in the past where maybe City Hall, something got dropped or something, got delayed in some way, and then all of a sudden 30 days is now halfway done, and then you're scurrying, and then people don't have time to prepare, especially if it's a significant issue.
Right, definitely. And sometimes, then sometimes there's times where there's multiple hearings or something like that. You decide you need multiple hearings. So I think anything up to 90 days makes sense. In fact, 90 days may be the best idea to handle that. Any other questions about the zoning ordinance?
I'll ask one more. Can you elaborate a little bit on the grandfathering that you mentioned earlier, just to make sure?
Sure. So the way that this ordinance is written, if there is a use that was allowed, a use of property that was allowed before this proposed amended ordinance is adopted, then that property owner can continue to use the property in that way, unless they expand the use. I'm trying to remember what page it was again, but anyway, expand the use or Stop using it for a year. And the use, stop using it for a year.
I don't see the page either.
39, I'm sorry.
There you go.
At the bottom. So that use can continue unless the use is expanded, it's discontinued for a period of a year, or if it's changed to another use. And you know, my chicken example was just a simple example, but I mean that applies to a whole lot of different scenarios. And but it's real important that you guys are aware of this, because I think in the public comments, I think you'll probably hear some you know, concerns, and you know, they're legitimate concerns. Well, I've been doing this for 20 years. Well, if you've been doing that for 20 years and that was allowed under the prior ordinance, then you can keep doing that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking about this too. Another thing too is something that I think a lot of you already know, but you know, a lot of zoning and code-based issues are totally reactive on the side of cities. You know, a city could have a rule that says nobody can have a basketball goal and they're in the middle of a public street. Well, unless the neighbors complain, I highly doubt that basketball goal is going anywhere. In fact, I think Savannah has an ordinance like that, and I drive by a basketball goal all the time. You know what I'm getting at? So, you know, that's another important thing for people to, you know, recognize if they're concerned about this ordinance. You know, is that cities are not really in the business of annoying their citizens. They're not. You know, they just don't want to do that. Cities on the other hand have to enforce their laws, and so if you know, what may seem like a fairly minor violation to some is called to the city's attention, and in fact it is a violation, well, then the city may have to go out there and take steps to address it. But this city in particular is not going to go out and tell somebody to, you know, make a change, you know, within the next 1 hour. You know, the city works with people and cooperates with people, and so that's the intent of this ordinance too. Anything else? Okay. All right. The next one I wanted to talk to you about is the building regulations, and that is the ordinance 2020-09. The building regulations are really staff level situations. Okay, so you know, this is basically you know, how do I get a certificate of occupancy, things like that. Those issues are generally handled at the staff level. I don't think I've actually in my career ever seen anything from a building regulation come before a planning and zoning commission that I can think of. I can't think of one, but anyway, it's possible. So I don't tell you that to say don't look at it. I'm just letting you know that as far as your role in this process, it doesn't come up very often, unless I'm wrong. But I did skim your minutes. I didn't see it having come up. But anyway, that's what these are. These are updated building regulations. The one place where you could come is the fact that on page 14 of that document, section 2.29, it states that an appeal from a decision of the building official can be taken to the Planning and Zoning Commission. And that mechanism is the same way that it's done under the zoning ordinance. And so that means that you would handle them in accordance with section 1103, which is basically to, you know, hear and decide appeals is what it says. But so, but that'll really be uncommon, and it would be a situation, generally speaking, where you're trying to, you know, understand everything, and potentially you're going to want your building official there to help you understand what's going on. And I would expect that most of the time it's going to come up from somebody who simply does not understand building regulations, meaning a private property owner or somebody like that, and they just can't believe that they've got to, pour a concrete foundation or something like that. And your role a lot of times in those scenarios, I would expect, if it ever happens, is going to be pretty much one of peacemaker and just kind of helping them understand that no, you really do have to comply with these rules, and these rules are designed to protect you. Hurricanes happen, that kind of a thing. So I'm intentionally being quick on this because I really don't think you're going to see a whole lot of the building regulations. But do you have any questions or any comments about the building regulations? Next and final is subdivision regulations, and these do concern you because you have the role of approving major subdivisions. A major subdivision is a subdivision of property into 4 or more lots. And so I'm sure you guys know this, but just as an example, let's say a property owner of 20 acres is right outside the city and they want to be served by city water and sewer. Well, what they're likely to do, especially once we get, we get everybody, familiar with our processes, they're likely to come to the city seeking to be annexed with their raw land. And then they will then come to you with their application for a major subdivision, meaning there's 4 or more lots they're seeking to have subdivided. And then your role is to determine if they have met the requirements of the ordinance in relation to that application for a major subdivision. And those are, fortunately for you, very well spelled out as far as whether or not they've met those requirements. But that is one of your roles, is to approve major subdivisions, approve or deny major subdivisions. You're going to have a whole lot of staff level support for those scenarios, or you should have a lot of staff level support for those scenarios. But when those come before you, it's one of those matters that I would just say keep an eye out for them, because it's helpful to be prepared for those, a day before the meeting or so, just to make sure you understand what is being sought, and so you can get any questions, or at least so that you can identify questions that you may want to ask about that in advance. But again, it's pretty clear. There's the ordinance spells out what what the requirements are and how they can meet them. You've also got the role of approving master plans for phased developments. I don't think that's going to happen very often, but it might. If I was a developer, even though I may not have to come before you to discuss a master plan, I may feel that I've got an opportunity to come to you in a different context to talk about it, site plan approval or something like that. I may tactically decide that I want to come talk to you guys really early on about my master plan, what I'm doing. That's just good politics. So that's the kind of one way you might see a master plan for a phase development come to you. But I don't think that would be common. Also, you have the role of reviewing planned development applications. That's discussed on page 37. I don't know, Mr. Mayor, do y'all have any planned developments in the city yet at this time?
For example,
Like
what do you mean?
Then probably not. All right, so a planned unit development is something that your zoning ordinance allows, and what that is it's basically a developer comes to the city on the front end and tries to jump through all the hoops right away. I thought your ordinance has a planned development. If not, I need to take this out of the. I need to take this out.
I think our old one did. I don't know if the new.
If the old one did, then this one should.
There's none currently active, but I'm sure we have one potential coming down the line from a few meetings we've had at City Hall and discussed with I think it was even mentioned by our city manager at the last city council meeting.
Okay, So plan development is
That's in
is a,
section 607 in the new one.
oh, thank you. Okay, great. So a plan development is it's a neat concept. Yeah, I see it. Okay, so it's a neat concept. It's basically, they come and get everything or almost everything approved on the front end. And so it's just kind of all together. A good example of a plan development is,
Cooler.
well, sort of,
Yeah.
sort of. But it's I was thinking about Atlantic Station
Sort of,
in
you're right.
Atlanta.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, it's like, here's how I'm going to lay out my roads. Here's where I'm going to put the houses. Here's where I'm going to put the commercial uses, etc. It's one of those kind of things where they bring everything to the forefront and try and get it done that way. It's expensive to do to come forward with a plan development application, and so what I've been seeing in my career is that plan developments were being applied for somewhat regularly when I started out doing city work in '06, and they're just not common anymore because there's so many other ways to get to that same place a little bit less painfully. But like I say, it's an upfront expense for the developer. If they come to you and want to do it, it's interesting. It's always intriguing when they do that. But like I say, they're not common. But if they do, you would have that role of reviewing the plan developments and making sure that they have complied with the requirements of the ordinance and things like that. You also have the role of approving street names. In fact, on page 39, I believe it says you have to. Yeah, no road or street shall be named on a plat or deed without approval by the Planning and Zoning Commission. So that'll be something that may come to you from time to time. There's a whole lot of laws on that as far as what roads can be, and I forget everything they say, but it's pretty clear as far as you can't have a duplicated name or anything like that. Let's see, and then finally, you have the role on page 41 of holding public hearings on amendments to the subdivision regulations. And for that, you would issue recommendations to council on those. So your decision would not be binding. And that is almost exactly 1 hour overview of these three ordinances. Does anybody have any questions?
As you can tell, I like to ask questions. Can you summarize? I know we got some new people in both on this committee and on council on the call. So, how things bounce around between planning and zoning and our city council, if that makes sense. And if you're not prepared to talk about that, that's fine. But I thought it would be good to think through or talk through how things after they're applied or submitted to planning and zoning, how it goes back and forth, maybe between city council, or if there's what that process looks like.
Sure. And tell me if I misunderstand, but yeah. So the Planning and Zoning Commission plays such a critical role because Planning and Zoning Commission focuses so much on land use, whereas the city officials are focused on not just land use, but governance of the city as a whole. And so Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendations need to be taken really seriously by the city council, and I expect that's what they do. And so your recommendation, the role that you would play in making a recommendation on a rezoning application is really important because if you recommend denial, that's going to go to city council. City council is going to know you said that. They're going to know that their city attorney is going to tell them to consider that carefully. And so, that's just one example of that back and forth. On the other hand, for example, where we are today is, we got direction to seek to amend and restate the zoning ordinance. And it's now before Planning and Zoning Commission for its recommendations to the city and, its comment, its feedback on those things. And again, that's taken really seriously by the city council and should be. And I'll of course remind city council, or Bobo will, that they need to take those kind of things seriously. And then the other thing too is just to reiterate from earlier is there's a lot of instances where the buck stops at the planning and zoning commission, street names being one example. Any appeal that goes to you, or I'm sorry, any variance that's sought, if you deny it or approve it and there's no appeal, that's final. The approval of a variance is a good example of that, because if you approve the the variance application, well, the applicant's not going to appeal, and so that likely is the end of that. Does that answer your questions, Mr. Reiser?
Yeah, it sure does. I just always, when I was on planning and zoning, it was always a question whether or not it was, if the business was complete or if it had another level to go through. I think that's important too when you're talking to applicants. Are we done, or is there something more that they have to do?
Right.
Exactly. Mr. Perkins, to piggyback what Mr. Reeser just said, absolutely prior, and I know Mr. Dean, you also can contest to this too. When you served on planning and zoning, a lot of our items that we addressed, we only recommended them to council for final approval. Now, does that still exist, or that goes away, that what decision planning and zoning makes, that's final there? Or it depends on what the ordinance or what the recommendation is?
1 second, I'm sorry, Mr. Mullins asking me a question.
Say again?
Mr. Mullins is asking me, or tell me something. I'm trying to follow him. 1 second.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Power of city council within 15 days can hear appeals if it's allowed by the.
Okay. Okay. So the section 1104 of the zoning ordinance says that an appeal would have to be filed within 15 days after your planning and zoning commission has rendered its decision. Does that answer your question, Mr. Harden?
Well, I didn't ask a question in reference to that. Okay. I guess in the procedures that we once planning and zoning only made recommendations to council for final approval. We didn't completely approve anything. We either approved or denied, but of course, council had the final say on whether it's yay or nay.
Right, right. And that would still be the case. So like on a rezoning application, you're making a recommendation on a rezoning application. Okay. That always goes to council.
Okay, very well. So nothing's changed there?
No, sir, nothing's changed on that at all.
The reason the rezoning goes to council is because we're essentially making the law of what that zoning is. It's just like writing any kind of law. So the power of the zoning board still stands what it used to be, where it was approving variances and making recommendations. And there was another power we discussed. What was it, Ben? Variances and
special use permit. Yeah. Right. But yeah, that's right. I mean, just to Mr. Reeser, as Mr. Reeser noted. I mean, believe it or not, this map, that's going to be law. And so when you amend it to change, somebody's property from R1 to, C1 or whatever, that is the changing of the law of the city of Guyton. And so that's the reason it has to go to city council, because it is a change of the city's law. Yes, nothing's changing there.
Okay, very well. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Anybody else have any questions?
All right.
I think what is changing, Lon, is the fact that we're having this conversation, so that the planning and zoning is more well informed, as well as the council, and the roles that we both play, and the spirit that we should play them in. So I'm looking forward to a healthy communication between the two.
Exactly. Yes, I likewise, and I hope it's the same sentiments of everyone on the board. with all the new members, that we continuously work together in harmony, and that we have these ordinances before us. We have our marching orders.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, thank you all so much. I'll be here. I think next item on the agenda was public comments. I'll be here to help answer any questions in that regard if you'd like, sir.
Okay. At this time, we entertain any public comments. Will there be any public comments at this time? Any questions? Silas, give consent.
Mr. Harden,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
can you hear me? This is
Yes, I
Sharon.
can.
Wilson.
State your name, please.
This is Sharon Wilson.
Yes, ma'am.
I have been taking notes, so I have a few questions that I'd like to get some answers on. Can you not hear me?
We all can hear you.
Okay. The first question I have is, who will be enforcing this zoning ordinance if anyone is out of what the ordinance allows?
I can answer that if you'd like, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. You please answer, please.
So the ordinance is enforced typically first at a staff level, meaning in this instance, the city manager or his, somebody he designates to do that. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not, the city's practice is not to go around looking for minor violations, and that's not going to change. At least that's certainly my expectation. But if there was an issue that was brought to the attention of the city manager, he would either take steps to address that issue, or he would direct a staff member to take steps to address that issue.
All right, that's fair. All right. My next question is, I've lived here for 18 years. Whenever we moved here, this is a chicken question, Mr. Chris. When we moved here 18 years ago, then I asked specifically, is there any ordinances as to livestock, non-domestic animals? Assured there was nothing in any ordinance. A little over 5-6 years ago, we did start with chickens, and again, before I started again, then I called again to the city hall. Is there any ordinance? So unbeknownst to me, I've been breaking ordinance for all this time, because it is in the old ordinance that you have to have a special permit, and I never requested a special permit. So since I never got the original special permit, but I've had them, will I still be grandfathered in? I can't prove that I've had a special permit, because I never knew I was supposed to have one. I was told there wasn't an ordinance except pigs. Can't have pigs in this town.
Well, I don't know if you have video, but you would have seen my head jerk, because I thought that chickens were allowed in the prior ordinance, actually.
Me too.
Yeah. Are you sure about that, ma'am? Or?
Well, I thought I asked for the ordinance as it was now, the existing ordinance.
Right.
And I read about a garden without, but then you could get a special permit. Perhaps I was sent the proposed ordinance. I don't know.
I'm not 100% positive, but I do recall as well that the R1 zoning did require a special use permit. When we rezoned Pat McCall's property from C1 to R1, there was a discussion about non-domestic animals. And you could have domestic animals, of course, domesticated animals, but non-domesticated, like not dogs and cats. There was a permit for R1 that could be applied for.
Yeah, unless I was not sent the existing ordinance, then I read and compared, because after I read it, then I thought, well, is this something new or is this something old? So I went back and asked for the original ordinance, or the existing ordinance, I'm sorry. So anyway, even though I do not have a special permit, it's not going to be in anybody's minutes or documented anywhere. Am I still grandfathered in?
We need to do some research, ma'am, but my comment about, a zoning being kind of a reactive process a lot of way would hold true, I think, for you. In other words, unless your neighbor were to bring that up, then I don't think you would ever have to even think about it. And then on top of that, my thought would be that if you've been doing that for 18 years and apparently there's been no complaints, and you came to the city council planning and zoning commission to apply for that special use permit, I think city council would find it very significant that you've been doing that for 18 years, and the planning commission would find it very significant you've been doing that for 18 years. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Also, in the ordinance, it only speaks of poultry.
What
how about other non-domesticated animals? I don't have any, but I'm just asking, is that not even obtainable with a special permit? Because it only, the new ordinance only specifies garden with poultry. So
I guess as it's written now, you would have
there's no way to get a special permit for anything else?
not as it's currently written, but I will say that, public comment time is, I mean, this is a time for people to make suggestions about that.
Let me step in and say it does state under special permit uses, general purpose farm or garden that includes the keeping of poultry or non-domestic animals. So wouldn't that special use permit include?
Yes. You are correct, Russ. Thank you. All right, can we check on is a special permit needed or am I truly grandfathered in? And then structure, outbuildings, temporary or permanent. Are those going to be grandfathered in?
They generally would be, yes. Are you talking about the accessory? Are you looking at the ordinance itself, ma'am, or are you just talking about it in general?
Sir, I wasn't going to print that many pages.
I don't blame you.
And the only way I can access it is on the same tablet I'm talking to you on. So.
Okay, let me look. I think you're talking about accessory uses. Does that sound familiar?
Just outbuildings.
Ben, I believe when we discussed this, you stated that any standing existing building, when this came under, when this was sworn in or approved, that would be grandfathered in, that we're not going back on anything we've already got.
That's correct, and that's yes. And ma'am, again, definitely suggest take a look at section 709 because it really does address the grandfathering, and it.
Okay.
It's pretty clear language. I mean, I know it's not perfect. It's because it's still got to go through the land use kind of talk, but I mean, it really is pretty explicit as far as saying that it doesn't use the word grandfather, but I mean, it's basically saying that use can continue. So yes, I don't see any issues there for you.
Okay. Let's see, 709, is that the page 39 that you spoke of earlier?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. One last thing. You spoke of extending the timelines because of right now, the reason is COVID from 30 to 90 days. But then whenever we talked about the appeal process, the appeals are still at 15 days. First of all, I don't think you should extend the timelines on an ordinance that should be forever and ever and ever until it would take a change of ordinance to change it, perhaps a temporary. But if you do, then should we also extend the 15-day appeal? Because if 30 days is tough, 15 days is tough.
Right. Well, again, you know, with the you know, with a lot of these types of issues, we're obviously in extraordinary times. You know, let's say we have passed an ordinance and it's got a 15-day cutoff, and somebody, you know, gets hit with COVID, and calls the city and says, you know, I don't have time to file my appeal right now. You know, doctors got me quarantined. You know, special considerations can be made. They will be made in those kind of circumstances. I don't think we would want to upend the apple cart just to address something like that. But you know, that's one of the benefits of living in a small town is you're not going to have a city shut the door on you because you've got COVID and you're unable to come to City Hall to drop off your appeal.
I agree, and that's why I'm asking why, if 30 days is the norm, would be the norm, but for COVID, then wouldn't it be better to just keep it at 30 rather, and then if you need to do a state of emergency like we've done before, until the state of emergency is lifted, then that's extended to 90 days instead of making the whole ordinance
Right.
90 days permanently. Do you
I think
see
you got a
what?
hungry cat back there. No, I think you're.
That's not my cat, but I do have a GP that's fixing to bark.
The reason I was thinking after we talked about it for a while, the reason I was thinking that to extend the deadline was actually not as much related to COVID as I was thinking about just the scheduling challenges and other reasons. Because yeah, you're right. COVID can be addressed in so many other ways. You know, I was trying to remember even some of the city's emergency ordinances may already extend deadlines. I know they extend a lot of deadlines, but I think it's a fair point you're making there. I do think that a little more time.
I just asked you to consider it, and that was just one of my takeaways. And if you are going to extend that deadline, then be fair on the other side as well. So,
right. That's a great point. Thank you.
And I think that's it. And I'll get back with after I can look up the special permit, the existing ordinance does require special permit.
Yes, I gather that you know the mayor well, so we'll get back in touch with you on that. That's a good question.
Russ, I know you want me to keep eggs coming, right? Thank y'all. Have a good evening.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.
I was going to make that joke mid discussion about like how many of the eggs I've eaten from our chickens. It's kind of like it's in their favor.
Russ won't be complaining.
All right. Will there be any other public comments at this time or questions? Going once, twice, 3 times. Thank you. We gave an opportunity for public comments. Is anything else, Mayor or Mr. Perkins?
Lana, I'd like to go over a couple of dates. So we have a public hearing for this, and the public hearing will be in person. at the Leisure Services Building, at least at the complex. That is what has been advertised. Public hearings are still required by state law to be had in person. We'll be social distancing, masking up, and broadcasting it live somewhere online. But that public hearing is August 25th at 6 p.m. That's the planning and zoning public hearing. That'll be, I think I'll be chairing that, but it'll be pretty much just for the public to come forward and ask questions, same as this is, but it's to meet the legal requirements. Correct, Ben?
Yes.
So we had that first public hearing. Following that public hearing on August 25th is the 7 o'clock planning and zoning meeting. That is currently planned to be at the same location. If COVID continues to increase, as public meetings can't, the planning and zoning meeting can be held online, we may switch that. That's going to be discussed between me and you, Lon, and figure out how we want to move forward with best advice from the CDC staff, Department of Health, yada, yada.
Okay.
The second public hearing for this will be September 8th at 6 p.m. That'll also be in public at the C.D. Dean Complex, Leisure Services area, followed by our September council meeting, which we will have the second reading of the ordinance. So your upcoming planning and zoning things are August 25th, 6 p.m. Public hearing regarding this at Leisure Services. August 25th, 7 p.m. There will be a planning and zoning meeting, either there or online, depending. And September 8th, the second public hearing. But this tonight has just been a workshop and a very successful one. I'd like to say thank you to Ben Perkins, planning and zoning and council people and citizens who have attended, as well as Tina and Bill. It has been a calling of mine to make planning and zoning work better, as is where Marshall and I cut our teeth. And I'm very pleased with all the work you've done, and I appreciate it greatly.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, those council members that are on, and thank you, Mr. Perkins, and the Planning and Zoning Committee. Okay, at this time, we will consider this workshop closed if there's no other items to discuss. Silence give consent. Good evening, everyone. Have a great evening. Take care, and we'll see you on August 25th at 6 p.m.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Good night.